All right, you ready? Buckle up because this time we are diving headfirst into a topic that's been debated for centuries: monarchy versus democracy. And judging by the stack of sources you sent our way, you're not just skimming the surface here. Oh no, you want to plunge into the really deep end, talking about power dynamics, individual liberty, the fundamental purpose of any government.
It's a fascinating exploration, isn't it? The sheer range of viewpoints you've provided, some sources, are practically launching a full-on assault on the very concept of democracy, while others seem to be yearning for a return to a time of, well, kings. It's pretty clear you're grappling with some pretty big questions here.
You can say that again, and we are absolutely here for it. So let's kick things off with what I gotta say are some pretty scathing critiques of democracy. We're talking about democracy is Satanism and why I will never vote again.
Yeah, those titles alone definitely grab your attention.
Right. I mean, talk about a conversation starter.
For sure. And it's not just provocative headlines either.
Yeah.
When you dig into the core arguments, that's where things get really interesting.
Absolutely.
Like the author of Democracy is Satanism, they're not pulling any punches. This isn't just about democracy being a flawed system to them. It's about how it fundamentally undermines our sense of shared identity. You know,
Okay. Yeah, I see that.
they argue that it sets different groups against each other, twisting this idea of a common good into a battleground of competing interests.
Okay, so it's like instead of everyone working together, it's all about.
Exactly. It becomes this us versus them mentality, which they argue, well, it erodes the very fabric of society.
And they go way back to trace the roots of this idea, too. Like, they point out this historical trend of viewing cities, which are often seen as these centers of democracy, as places where morality goes to die, right? Where everyone's just out for themselves. Makes you wonder if there's something inherently flawed with democracy.
Right. Like, does it inevitably lead to this kind of individualism, this me first mentality?
Exactly. And that's where why I will never vote again comes in. This author sees the whole system as rigged, like it's designed to keep us trapped. Voting to them is nothing more than a symbolic act.
It's like they're saying real power lies somewhere else entirely. They even call voting, and I quote, the manner of exchange used by the system and the oligarchs to harvest what they want from the people.
Wow. Harvest what they want. That's a pretty bleak outlook.
Yeah, not exactly uplifting stuff.
So, okay, we've got two sources here, both deeply suspicious of democracy. One even going so far as to call it satanic. I mean, talk about strong language. But inflammatory rhetoric aside, they're tapping into a very real sentiment.
Absolutely. I mean, look
Yeah.
around. There's this growing distrust in institutions, this sense that the systems we rely on are failing us. It's a sentiment that's fueling political movements all over the world. And in that kind of climate, yeah, these radical critiques of democracy,
Yeah.
they're going to find an audience.
They definitely hit differently in today's world. Okay, so we've got the burn it all down perspective on democracy covered, but then we're hitting you with a completely different take with these next two sources. We're shifting gears from democracy to monarchy. We're talking the Canadian monarchy and King Charles III, and to defend that which refuses to defend itself. And this is where things get really interesting because on the surface, these sources seem kind of contradictory. They have this deep respect for monarchy, for what it represents, but at the same time, they're deeply critical of how it's playing out in reality.
It's a fascinating paradox, right? It's like they're holding on to this idealized vision of what monarchy should be, this embodiment of a higher purpose, this connection between the ruler and the ruled, while simultaneously wrestling with the fact that the actual institution, the current monarch, doesn't quite live up to that ideal.
Exactly. And both authors point to King Charles as a prime example of this disconnect. For instance, the Canadian monarchy and King Charles III argues that true monarchy embodies a single sovereign power. But these days, they're seeing that power reside not with the crown, but with.
The government.
Yeah.
They actually say they have more respect for the king than for the Canadian government.
Wow. That's saying something.
Right. And it's not just about Canada. They see this trend playing out across the entire Commonwealth, this prioritizing of so-called democratic principles over what they see as the true interests of the crown and the nation.
So it sounds like for this author, it's less about King Charles himself and more about the system straying from what they see as this core essence of monarchy.
Exactly. It's like they're clinging to this ideal even as the reality seems to be slipping away. And get this, they even hint that maybe, just maybe, Canada would be better off with a different royal family altogether. It's really a glimpse into this internal struggle, this deep desire to hold on to an ideal, even when reality seems to be telling a different story.
And that leads us right into to defend that, which refuses to defend itself.
Yeah.
This author is really putting their heart out there. You can almost feel their disappointment with how the monarchy is, well, not living up to its potential. Like, they expected so much more.
And they are not holding back on the criticism either. They single out specific decisions made by King Charles, decisions they see as a betrayal of everything the monarchy should stand for. One example that really gets to them is the removal of hereditary peers from the House of Lords.
Oh, right. For those of us who aren't quite up on our British parliamentary structure, the House of Lords is kind of like their version of the Senate, right?
Exactly. And these hereditary peers, they were members who basically inherited their positions through family lines. So it was a way of maintaining this kind of historical continuity within the system.
I see. So it's like a direct link to the past, a living embodiment of tradition within the government.
Exactly. And for this author, removing them is like cutting off a part of the monarchy's roots.
And another example they bring up is King Charles's support of the euthanasia bill. They see that as a huge departure from what they view as the monarchy's traditional role as protector of life. But it's not just about these specific policies, is it?
You hit the nail on the head. It's bigger than individual policies. What the author sees here is a pattern, this creeping feeling that the monarchy is losing its way, that it's abandoning its duty to safeguard a certain vision of British identity, that the very soul of the institution is at stake.
Which brings us to that term, ultra. They're using it to describe someone so devoted to a cause, so passionate about it, that they're willing to criticize it harshly, even attack it if they believe it will ultimately make it stronger.
It's like tough love on a whole other level. And we see this ultra perspective in both these pro-monarchy sources, this really fascinating mix of fierce loyalty with this, I don't know, almost desperate desire to tear it all down just to build it back up better. You're sending us not one, but two sources like this. I got to ask, does this ultra perspective resonate with you? Something to think about for sure.
Definitely a lot to unpack there. All right, so we've talked about democracy being on the chopping block, monarchy idealized yet harshly criticized, and now get ready for a curveball, because this next source, The Pagan Nature of Power, really throws a wrench into the works. This one takes a very different stance, arguing that politics is inherently amoral, that it operates by a different set of rules.
It challenges that whole idea of a Christian nation, a righteous ruler, arguing that true political power often requires actions that clash with traditional morality. It's a bold claim, and they use some pretty compelling examples from history to make their case.
They actually come right out and say, and I quote, "To wield power, one is forced to take or order actions that are immoral." And to illustrate this point, they bring up figures like Tsar Nicholas II and King Louis XVI, both deeply religious rulers who ultimately met tragic ends. They argue that these rulers were essentially too good, too guided by their personal morals for the often brutal realities of leadership.
And they make this really interesting comparison between the historical stances of the Orthodox and Catholic churches on violence and warfare. You see, traditionally, Orthodox soldiers would eat a year after taking a life before taking communion, while the Catholic Church at times issued indulgences for acts committed during the Crusades. It just goes to show how differently faith and power have intertwined throughout history.
It all circles back to this unsettling truth about power, doesn't it? Sometimes doing what's considered right on a personal level might clash with what's deemed necessary to maintain order or protect a nation or achieve a larger goal. It's that whole idea of the necessary evil.
And what makes this source so thought-provoking is that it takes these huge historical examples and connects them to our own lives. Look, most of us aren't kings or queens, but we've all faced those situations where the right choice isn't so clear-cut. Think about your own experiences. I mean, have you ever been in a position where you had to make a decision, maybe at work or in a relationship, that felt a little like a necessary evil?
It really gets you thinking about the choices we make, doesn't it? And what's interesting is that this whole necessary evil thing, it's not always about those big life-altering decisions. It often pops up in these subtle ways, those everyday compromises that we hardly even notice.
No, absolutely. Think about how often you hear phrases like, "That's just how the game is played," or "You got to break a few eggs to make an omelet."
Right. It's like we're almost justifying it before we even think about it.
Exactly. And it's those little compromises, those times we brush aside our values for what we think is the greater good. Those are the things that can really add up over time.
It's like a slow drip, drip, drip that can wear down even the strongest foundation if we're not careful. And before you know it, we're living in a world where those in power are justifying all sorts of questionable actions as just part of the job, while the rest of us are left trying to make sense of it all.
And that's exactly why diving into these sources, grappling with these ideas, it's so important. Because once you start to recognize those pressure points, that seductive logic of necessary evil, you're in a much better position to resist it. You can start drawing your own lines in the sand.
To say, hold on a second, that might be how it's always been done, but I'm not okay with that. Which leads to another question. Can we even create systems, whether it's governments or businesses or anything in between, that don't rely on this kind of moral compromise? Is it even possible?
Now, that is the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's a tall order, for sure. But shouldn't that be what we're striving for?
I like to think so. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here today. We've gone from those fiery takedowns of democracy to this almost wistful longing for a more ideal version of monarchy, and then to this really thought-provoking look at the very nature of power itself. If you're feeling a little intellectually dizzy right now, I don't blame you. We've been down quite the rabbit hole.
We have. From democracy as Satanism all the way to, well, maybe the real Satan is those compromises we make in the name of progress and power.
Ooh, I like that. That's a good one. And while we may not have walked away with easy answers, I don't think any of these sources were trying to offer those. What we do have is a lot to think about, a lot to mull over.
As always, it's not about us telling you what to think, but about giving you the tools to think more critically, more deeply about these really complex issues. And hey, maybe even spark a few conversations of your own along the way.
Exactly. So tell us what resonated with you during this deep dive. Did any historical events, current political movements, maybe even personal experiences come to mind? Because the best conversations, the ones that really stay with us, they don't end when the episode's over. They spark something new, keep those mental gears turning. So keep those thoughts coming, and who knows, maybe your insights will inspire our next deep dive. Until then, happy pondering.